might remember that Moses had gone up the mountain for an extended visit with God. And that this visit wasn't just a brief drop in the bucket, so to speak. No, indeed, this was a visit that lasted 40 days and 40 nights. So it shouldn't surprise us to find out that our Israelites were disappointed, disillusioned, frustrated, and angry. Without Moses, they were nothing. They had nothing. They didn't even have God. Because as far as the Israelites were concerned, the presence of Moses was the same thing as God with them. No Moses, no God. Anyway, it stood to reason that the Israelites decided to look somewhere else for guidance and comfort. They thought they needed something substantial and solid to worship. They figured that it would be a whole lot easier to focus their worship on something tangible, something they could see and hold on to. So they fabricated a golden calf from the ornaments they wore. You remember that part of the story. Anyway, while all this idol worshiping was going on, Moses was up there on that mountain receiving the law from God. And heaven knows that visit lasted too long. Because by the time Moses showed up again, the people had abandoned God and were deeply involved in worshiping that golden calf. And so when our pal Moses discovered what the people had done, he was furious. He ranted and raved and blew his staff. And then Moses did the only thing he could think of. He went back up that mountain to God. And now as we arrive at the point of the story where today's lesson begins, we're about to discover what God has in store for those people who had turned their backs on God. Poor Moses found himself smack in the middle of God's anger. God was so angry with the Israelites that God decided enough is enough. No more would God be the one to accompany the people on their journey. No, God told Moses a messenger, an angel, would go along with them to guide them and protect them. God was sitting this one out. God had had it with these stiff-necked people. They would just have to go on without God's personal presence. Now that was fine for God, but not for Moses. God's decision put Moses right back in the middle of a dilemma. He didn't want to be the one to tell the Israelites that God was going to stay on the mountain and not to come with them. So Moses began to negotiate. Come on, God, he said. The people need you. They need to know that you're with them to guide them and sustain them. After all, God, you promised. Once again, God relented. God agreed to continue to be with the people on their journey. So since Moses was faithful, God decided to remain faithful to the promise made with the Israelites. God would go with the people after all. So encouraged by God's change of heart, Moses pushes God just a little bit more. By the way, Moses said, the people need some sort of sign from you. It would really work well if they knew exactly who you are. God, maybe you could show yourself in all your glory to me, and then the people would be more willing to follow. After all, God, believing is seeing. If I could just see you, I know everything would turn out okay. I'm sure that if people knew I had seen you, that they would stop trying to find idols to worship. How about it, God? And there's something to be said for Moses' logic. Perhaps if we could just see God, if we just knew that God was with us, if there could be some sort of tangible sign, maybe something like in neon lights up in the sky, or something we could hold in our hands, then maybe we would be more willing to believe and follow God's direction. Indeed, it's so much easier for us to believe in something we can hold on to in our hands. But God, after all, is God. And God declared no one was going to see God's face. However, you know, Moses, if it would help matters here, here's what I will do, God declared. I'm going to walk past you. You won't be able to see my face. That would just kill you. But you'll be able to see my back. It's the best I can do, Moses. And so, according to the story, that's just what happened. Moses managed to catch a glimpse of God's back, and somehow that was enough. It was God's way of helping Moses and us understand that whether or not we see God, God is with us. It's also a reminder that God gives us what we need rather than what we want. Our gospel lesson this morning is an attempt by some temple leaders to put Jesus between a rock and a hard place. Today, Jesus is confronted by Pharisees and Herodians in the temple in Jerusalem. Now, I think it would be helpful for us to understand just who these temple leaders were. The fact is that the Pharisees and the Herodians hated each other. They spent a whole lot of time throwing darts at one another with their eyes. In other words, if looks could kill, they all would have been dead. So here's how it was. You see, Palestine was a colony of Rome, of the Roman Empire, and the Jews were paying taxes that supported the army and government that occupied their country. The Jewish people had grievances around the question of taxation. It turns out we aren't the first people to object to taxation without representation. Anyway, there were people on both sides of this taxation thing. Palestine had the Herodians who supported the Roman government, and therefore they supported paying tax to Caesar, while the Pharisees opposed anything having to do with Rome. They were committed to every detail of Jewish law and therefore objected to paying tax to Caesar for religious reasons. Now, given their divided loyalties, it was unlikely that anything could have caused the Pharisees and the Herodians to cooperate with each other, except for their mutual desire to see Jesus permanently removed. So they managed to put their heads together as they attempted to question Jesus about Caesar and God. Okay, tell us, what's it going to be, Jesus, they asked. Whom should we believe? Whom should we follow? Who is greater, Caesar or God? This time, the leaders of the temple thought they had Jesus right where they wanted him. Show us, they demanded. Tell us just exactly where our loyalties should be. These men knew that if Jesus denied Caesar's power, the Roman authorities would get him in treason. On the other hand, if he acknowledged Caesar's claim as a god, Jesus would be denying all that he had been teaching and preaching. You see, Jesus was definitely between a rock and a hard place. Or was he? Jesus once again was ready for the trap. He asked to see a coin with Caesar's image on it, and as he examined it, he said very plainly and clearly that whatever was due Caesar should be given to him, and whatever is due God should be given to God. Once upon a time, a long time ago, on a Sunday morning, a little girl was heading off to church. And before she left home, her mother handed her 2 quarters. Her mother said, the 1 quarter is for you to give to God, and the other one is for you to spend. But as the girl made her way to church, she started playing with the coins and tossing them up in the air. Well, as you might imagine, one of the quarters slipped out of her hand and rolled right down the sewer grate. So the little girl walked over to the grate, looked down sadly, and said, "Well, there goes God's quarter." Just as the Israelites before had created the gods that could be seen, idols that could be touched and held, so too many people in Jesus' day were led by the gods they could see, touch, and hold. And I think sadly today we're also tempted to worship and believe what we can hold and touch. Our gods can be all that we own. They could be the TVs that we are glued to every day, or our smartphones, or our iPads, or our laptops, or any number of our electronic devices. Our gods can be found in all the places where we shop these days, or in the many ways we can think of to spend our time and money. These are the gods we can see, and all too often they are the gods we tend to worship. Jesus is telling us to decide what belongs to Caesar and what belongs to God. In other words, just where do we place our loyalties? You know, God doesn't require us to see in order to believe. What our faith does require is that we seek a relationship with God, a relationship that requires more than spending 1 hour a week here at church. Now, back in the really early days of the Christian church, and I mean really early, say around the year 50, the town of Thessalonica was a thriving Roman metropolis. Many residents were materially well off. The town was in a great location, situated on both the land and sea routes of travel. Thessalonica was the capital of the Roman province of Macedonia. And since the city was so important, it shouldn't surprise any of us to know that most of its people were really into the Roman way of life. People worshiped the idols with songs, dances, and sacrifices. Men and women all over town enjoyed living the good life, filled with material possessions, wonderful prosperity, and all the other benefits given to people who followed the imperial program, accepting Caesar as Lord rather than some Jewish teacher who had been executed by the empire a few years ago. Anyway, in the midst of all this, there was a small group of people who just didn't buy into the worship of Roman gods, not to mention Caesar himself. They've been inspired by the Apostle Paul, who told them about Jesus and how there was another way to live in the spirit and love of one God, devoted to mercy, kindness, and forgiveness. After hearing all that Paul had to say, the small group decided to start a congregation, a brand new church. It wasn't easy in the face of so many hardships and challenges. Paul understood just how tough and downright dangerous it was to be a Christian presence in the middle of imperial Rome. The tiny yet faithful congregation somehow managed to continue their work and mission in spite of the dangers and against all odds. The going was pretty tough for this struggling group. The mission of the new congregation was devoted to following the teachings of Jesus. Membership for those early Christians meant unconditional friendship and support for one another. They cared for each other in all ways, emotionally, financially, and spiritually. They shared whatever they had with the widows, orphans, the sick, and lonely who needed help. spending a whole lot of time and effort writing to those struggling congregations. And Paul pointed out to the new congregation that they were expected to serve as examples to others. So, that's how we got Paul's first letter to the Thessalonians. Hey folks, he says, don't give up hope. Christ is here with you. The presence of the Holy Spirit is the presence of Christ among us all. What you have to do is live as Christ lived. Forget about all those idols and false gods. You know what's what. Act as though you really do believe in Jesus Christ. Let your actions speak for you. An ordinary woman once lived in a small town near Modesto, California. She wasn't famous, powerful, or influential. She was the kind of person we'd call a good neighbor. She was friendly, liked by her neighbors, and was good to her family. When the United States entered the Second World War, she supported the government until the government issued an order requiring all U.S. citizens of Japanese ancestry to be interned in relocation camps. Many of this woman's neighbors were Japanese Americans. She knew them and loved them as her friends. She went to Sacramento and lobbied the legislators. She wrote to the president to try to stop the camps and the government's confiscation of American Japanese property. She couldn't move the powerful and famous. She was just a nobody. The Disciples of Christ was the only official church body to protest the order to intern Japanese American citizens. Anyway, this lone woman bought all the American Japanese farms and homes in her town for $1 each and watched as her friends were taken away. When the camps were closed, and the Japanese Americans who survived had no homes left, when their lands were stolen, this woman's neighbors were lucky. She gave her friends and neighbors back their homes and land so that they might live. The author and theologian David Watson writes in Discipleship, "Today, the church is to truly become a community of God's people in a way that Christ demonstrated with his own disciples. It means much more than singing the same hymns, praying the same prayers, taking the same sacraments, and joining in the same services. It involves the full commitment of our lives and of all that we have to one another. Surely it's only when we lose our lives that we will find them. That's bringing the life of Jesus to others. This practical expression of love will speak more powerfully of the living God than anything else." You know, someone has observed that maybe we should be living our lives backwards. It's a sort of strange way of thinking how to live forward. How do we want to live our life today and in the future? When we get to the end of our lives, how do we want to see our relationship with God, the quality of our relationships with our family and friends? Do we end up looking back at a life filled with regrets, broken promises, and secrets? Or can we look back on experiences of peace and satisfaction, embracing God's abundant grace, knowing that God has used us in some way to make a meaningful difference in God's realm? Maybe if we learn to live our lives backwards, we could begin to see the big picture and realize what really matters